Hi there. My name's Todd, and I'm the lead pastor at City Life Church here in Vancouver, BC. It's my delight to continue on in this series of conversations on race, culture, and the church. If you're just joining us for the first time, we're so glad you can catch up on all the previous content. The easiest way is to go to thisiscitylife.com and scroll to the footer where you can connect easily with our YouTube page. Let's go to the next episode and let's carry on the conversation. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our ongoing conversation around race, culture, and the church. My guests for this conversation, Abigail, Aaron Derrickson. You guys, thank you so much for being along for the ride in this and for helping us. How are you guys doing? Doing all right?
Yeah, I'm good.
I'm feeling warm.
It is warm in this room, in this moment, but we will press on nonetheless. We shall persevere. I want to talk for a couple minutes about race and the church specifically, with the idea of looking at what Jesus had in mind when he gave his life for the church and how we can better move church forward and become that church that Jesus bled for, that he gave his life for in this cultural moment. I was reading this survey around race in America within the church. It was taken by the George Barna Group last year before the whole Black Lives Matter resurgence with the catalyst of George Floyd. And the statistics, I just want to read them to you. It said that 75% of Black Christians would say that the U.S. has a history of oppressing minorities, but only 42% of white Christians agreed with the statement. Do you think we have the same disparity in the church around the perception of race, whether it be Black or Indigenous or other minorities in our Canadian churches? Do you think the same kind of parallel, the dissonance, holds true here in Canada or not? And if so, why? Aaron, it's a loaded question, and I'm throwing it to you first.
I was actually going to be like, go ahead, Abigail.
Why don't you take this one first?
Go ahead, Abigail. Every single time. First of all, this is obviously like what the church should be doing in terms of this kind of dialogue, right? This is one medium to have that kind of dialogue, but there's other mediums to be able to do that within the church.
Yeah, we even talked about, even in setting this up, we wanted this to be a dialogue, and even how we were sitting with a table, sharing space around a table.
Yes.
The metaphor of it was important, right?
Totally. And I think that's this picture, or something similar to this picture, in terms of this egalitarianism that exists on this equality on this stage needs to be transported into the church. Jesus said, Jesus said, go make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. He did not say, go and colonize all nations and take away their culture and tell them they're not good enough and tell them that everything they have, their belief systems are completely and totally and utterly wrong. That really what that was, in my estimation, in terms of, my first degree was a major in history, in Canadian history, that is. And in terms of Canadian context, it was Europeans coming over and saying, I'm going to remake you in my image, in my idea of what it means to be white and whiteness. And so I think it's important to recognize and understand that it's not our image. It's not the white image in Canada. It's God's image. Yeah. It's Jesus' image. So good. It is who he is and who he is in Scripture, his character, his love, his compassion. You know that almost every time Jesus performed a miracle, he had compassion. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know what the precedent to empathy, which is the antidote to shame, is compassion. Mm-hmm. Research shows compassion, empathy, antidote to shame. And Jesus had compassion on people. Where is the church having compassion? Where is the heart of Jesus in that regard towards people of color? And of course, in my case, specifically Indigenous people. So kind of taking a full loop, I would say, this picture, this medium, insert compassion, doses and lots of compassion in the heart of Jesus to reflect the heart of God in all those mediums.
Yeah, I was reading through the book of Acts recently through the lens of this conversation, and it has honestly helped me to understand the gospel and its value on equality and removing those barriers intentionally, not reactively, but proactively at the front end. That's what Jesus did. He removed the barriers at the front end. No, every race, every color, every tongue, every tribe. Even in that first message in Acts chapter 2, I heard someone speaking into this issue recently, and Joel, the prophet of the Old Testament, is quoted by Peter in that famous Acts chapter 2 sermon where over 3,000 people on the day of Pentecost committed their lives to Jesus. Now think about this. This is Joel, the Old Testament prophet. At the time he spoke this, I'm going to read it for you. At the time he spoke this, the paradigm of the Jewish nation is that they were the only people God cared about. They were his only chosen people above all else. And certainly there is some backstory there that helps us understand God's full expression, what he was releasing in the new covenant, getting a little theologically deep here. But this is what Joel said. And I was trying to think about, what would Joel's contemporaries have thought about this, much less hundreds of years in the future when Peter makes this statement on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem amidst all these Jewish people in the heart of one of their sacred festivals, where he says this, he says, in the last days, says God, I will pour out my spirit upon all people. Right there, he speaks to these two things. He speaks to the classism that we see inherent in culture, and he speaks to the idea of racism, the minority and the majority, saying, hey, all people are who I'm going to pour out my spirit on. And then he says, your sons and your daughters will prophesy. He speaks to the issue of sexism. Men, women, male, female, made in the image of God are going to have God's spirit poured out on them. Your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. He's speaking to ageism here. So he's speaking to this picture of the church that Jesus died for as being free of classism and racism and ageism and sexism. And that's what Jesus bled for. And I think because of that, we have an obligation to build into that. So with that in mind, sorry, I got my preach on. I'm feeling the heat. Abigail, what about you? Talk a little bit about race in the church. Where do we and how do we better move forward in this season and in making it better?
Yeah, and in thinking about this, I was really thinking about, like, why do people have such a hard time accepting racism, and especially in the church? And I think I talked about this in a previous episode, but I would say I'm a recovering judgmental person. And I think...
I love that. Sometimes I've said to people, I'm a recovering sinaholic. Like, just... my proclivity is toward sin. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. And so when I got saved, I was about 13 when I kind of rededicated my life. I said the prayer maybe a lot of times when I was 7 years old. But when I was 13, I was like, this is what I'm doing. So I was walking in the straight and narrow and, also entering high school. So I remember just thinking, wow, like, look at me. Like, I'm a real Christian, I'm not a Christian in name only. And understanding that I had issues, but I was like, but not like those people.
Right.
And the first time someone, and I still really walked in this, and the first time someone called me out of my, like, how I walk in judging other people was like a couple years ago, 3 years ago. And someone said it, and I was like, no, what do you mean? And it's very hard to see the hard parts about yourself, especially if you consider yourself a Christian who is walking in this constant submission to Christ, because there are areas where I know I was still working through, and I could admit that, I could admit those sins, but it's the one sin. And I think the issue with racism is that we see it as this really bad thing that couldn't be me, I couldn't be doing that, and that's with judging, because the Bible clearly speaks about judging other people, and so I was like, couldn't be me, I'm not the one with the log in my eye, looking at the speck in another eye, maybe I'm the speck person. I was thinking about this, and sometimes you see yourself as the lost sheep, or as the son, the prodigal son, but how are we the Pharisee? Or how are we the son who said, but Dad, I've been here the whole time? How are we that person? And when you start to read the Bible in a different perspective and see the Pharisee in you, especially people who've grown up in the church, I think you start to understand why things like racism can be hard to see in the church or to see that issue because it requires you to see it in yourself. And
good.
Yeah, I can admit it's a horrible feeling to understand that racism exists, and it exists inside of you because you want to think it's like a KKK problem.
Right.
Or the people who, established residential schools, but it's not.
Right. And so we use the extremes to justify the more subtle expressions within ourselves. Isn't this funny? You're talking about racism, and something when you said this thought that made me think this. I think Christians are still approaching race as a cultural issue and not a spiritual one. And I think the church will be a leader in this conversation when we begin to approach it as a spiritual one, because what you're describing is how God's called us to respond in humility toward our own sinfulness. Yeah. And when we see it that way, it will be easy and joyful for us because we know the freedom in life that comes from honestly acknowledging our own sinfulness and inviting Christ into bringing that transformation.
Yeah. And I think the other part, and I don't know if you've heard this phrase, Aaron, is that I feel like as an academic or someone who's in like a professional field who has been educated, is I was thinking about like some people in my resistance is kind of, the way I think about it is like using the master's tools, right? I've come up in a Western educated system. I'm technically using the master's tools. To dismantle the master's house, which is the systemic racism that I think was the foundation of Canada and the United States, which we can just all admit that we're a colonial nation. That's just the reality. The Queen is still our leader. That's just what we are. And so when you're going up in the Western education system, we're kind of using the master's tools. But I was listening to this the other day, and it's like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house because they were never meant to dismantle the master's house. So I can go get a lot of postdocs on, and there's many people with postdocs on critical race theory, so many people with these with this education in the Western system, and have they dismantled the master's house? No. Does the master's house need to be dismantled? Yes, it does. But I think the key and the hope is that in Jesus, we can call out these systems.
Come on.
And I think we need to see that as Christians, it's not, everyone go to your house and just pray. And that's good, great. Yes, do that. But we need the action. We need to actually dismantle the system that exists. And that does start with the reflection, but also understanding that it's going to look radically different than what we perceive it to be. Like when Jesus came, people thought he was going to be this political ruler, like a political messiah, and he wasn't. It was radically different than what they thought he was. So how do we bring heaven on earth? I think we're going to have to sit with the discomfort, and it's not going to look, pretty and maybe not as proper as we want it to look like. It's going to take some complete mind shift and a complete, and this is maybe I just don't think that perhaps, I think a lot of people in the church want to, and it's a respectability politics, want to have a nice conversation.
Right.
They want to say, why don't you, people of color, invite us over for dinner and educate us? And we've been doing that.
Do the emotional labor for me.
Yeah, we have been doing that. And that's a master's tool. It's not going to dismantle the house. What's going to dismantle the house? Sometimes it's a crane. You just need to bulldoze it. And how do we do that? I think that's the radical nature of who Jesus is.
Oh, I think that gives me so much hope when you talk like this. When you say that this is the key that we need. We need Christ in this. We will not fix this until Christ has place and preeminence to bring inner transformation. It has to begin in our own hearts and acknowledging what's there. Thank you for that. I hope I'm not misspeaking in terms of your principles, but my heart is full right now. Aaron, any last words before we wrap this conversation?
Really quickly. Try to express this as best I can in this looming light. Pun intended. So, like, I think in the past, the church has looked to other disciplines and kind of like othered them and been like, no, like for instance, the health profession. Like all we need is the church. All you need is Jesus. And there's a reason why there's doctors there. I'm sorry, I'm not going to operate on you.
Yeah.
That's for a doctor to do, right?
We don't offer that service at City Life.
Right.
I don't do surgery.
We don't, not today anyways. But then, we take on these like meta narrative savior roles of like offering all knowledge for all things. And that's dangerous. We're supposed to teach, point back to Jesus and talk about the love of Jesus. And yes, teach that theology, which points back to Jesus. Having said that, there's institutions that are combating racism. And the university I come from is doing a fantastic job in putting policies and procedures into place and having people, Indigenous people sit at the table and have voice at the table. Yeah. And that's really awesome. And so my question is like, maybe this is why we're talking. It is why we're talking. Why is the church lagging behind? And so you're talking about this racism being a spiritual issue. Well, let's push that forward. Yeah. Let's move forward in that. The church is upon this rock. I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Well, baby boy, build that church. Like, here we go. Like, let's do this. Like, and it doesn't just very quickly. It doesn't boil down to like, we want you to come over so you can tell us all about your racist experience. Sorry, that was like a terrible it was like a voice I shouldn't be. But it's about educating yourself, picking up books. There's a place I know of called Chapters, and they have an entire section on Indigenous issues.
It's
both
amazing.
Fiction and nonfiction, right?
Yeah.
So if you like not real or real, which both are instructive, you can enjoy that. There's APTN, there's local Indigenous communities you can reach out to. A lot of them have their own cultural information centers. You can build a relationship, which is about, I know I'm rambling here, the last thing else, the reconciliation. God gave us a ministry of reconciliation. Well, part of that's a personal level. Part of it is like taking an elder out for a tea or for a coffee or going to the local counselor and saying, what can I do as a local churchgoer to not go down this path? What can the church do? And I get Jesus directs the church. Yes, it's his church, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't reach out and we shouldn't build a relationship.
Yeah. And I'd like to add to that because I did say that, the master's tools will never dismantle the house. And I do believe in that, but I also do think there's a lot of education out there. It doesn't mean that we should be silent. And I think as Aaron said, like, don't try and be a doctor or a surgeon. If the information is out there, take it and then think about how can the church be the one that is at the forefront of this information? Because sometimes I feel like we want to be so resistant to the pull of culture, but then we can think, okay, how can we lead culture
Absolutely.
in the way we want to go? And there's nothing wrong with the professions of the world.
No.
And, that's how we have microphones and tables. Jesus was a carpenter.
Yes.
His dad was a carpenter. That was still a thing he did.
And why we can record conversations like this because of that.
Yeah, so use the master's tools.
Yeah.
But I think in saying that, my point is also we need a shift. The tools are out there.
Yeah.
The education is out there. We need a shift, and it starts with educating yourself. Go to Chapters, buy the books. Many people have those books. I have a bunch, so you can borrow them.
Yeah.
I've read them.
My library is growing. There's also this awesome thing called the library.
Yes. And
they also have books just like this. I've got a few from there, and they didn't cost me a penny.
That reminds me of that scene from Good Will Hunting where he's in the bar and he goes to the Harvard masters in economics, and that master's in economics, he's trying to one up Matt Damon, and of course Matt Damon plays a genius, and he's like, oh, have you heard of so and so and so and so? He's got this long 90s hair, and Matt Damon owns him, and he's like, you paid $150,000 for a degree that you could have got for 5 cents in late fees at the local library.
Oh, I love it. 5 cents in late fees. There's the quote
In the
for this
90s.
episode. I think as you've been talking, what I've heard and what I want to kind of wrap up as a summary thought today is we sometimes as a church move away from issues like this because we wrongly think they're a distraction from the mission that we have. But if we would look differently, we actually can see within cultural moments like this the opportunity for the mission to move forward, for Christ to be made centered in culture, because his heart is for a people, a city, a nation, a world that reflects exactly what we're talking about here. And I would love to see the church not shy away from these things as inconveniences, but lean into these cultural opportunities. And like you said, stop waiting for other forces to create these kind of catalysts for these, but actually we could be the force proactively to lead them. I think that would honor Christ and bring us closer to his heart for his church. Thank you guys so much for this. I hope you guys will stick around for our final episode on race, culture, and the church, dropping soon online. Take care.